Hello, my name is Lizzie Gadd and I work at Loughborough University in the UK as a Research Policy Manager, and I also chair the iNorms Research Evaluation Working Group. And this breakout session is about journal metrics and what they can and they can't tell us. Okay, so I'm planning on looking at firstly the backlash against journal metrics and whether that's justified. Then I'm going to explore what we actually value about journals and whether we can really measure what we value about journals before thinking about what the future of responsible journal evaluation might look like. Okay, poor journal metrics. They've had such a bad press recently. This blog post by DORA chief Stephen Curry outlined why he was sick of impact factors. And of course, with the advent of the Declaration on Research Assessment, which formalised the community's unhappiness with this controversial metric, followed by the metric Tide in the UK and the Leiden Manifesto, the academic press is now littered with think pieces and advocacy pieces about responsible metrics in general, but journal metrics in particular, and of course the GIF itself is at the heart of the storm. But what's wrong with this simple little metric, the average cites per paper for a journal over the past 2 years? Well, the underpinning objections are these, summarised very neatly in DORA. Firstly, that any indicator that takes the mean of a skewed data set is on a hiding to nothing. As advocates point out, the median and mode of most journal citation distributions is 0. Secondly, that you can't compare a GIF in one field where they cite a lot with a GIF in another field where they cite less, as the average cites per paper will obviously be lower in less citation dense fields. Thirdly, that the different types of articles within a journal can of course have a significant impact on a journal's impact factor, as review papers are cited a lot more than non-reviews. And of course the GIF consists of citations to all articles in the journal divided by the number of so-called citable items, so excluding letters, etc., which is also problematic. Fourthly, that GIFs can be gamed by anxious journal editors by forming citation cartels and asking authors to cite more papers from their journal. And finally, that of course GIF is a proprietary metric owned by Clarivate Analytics, so no one can check the underlying data. But for me, I think there are 2 objections missing from this list, and the first is that the GIF and pretty much all journal metrics that I'm familiar with, that we use regularly, are all calculated using data sources that are heavily biased towards the global north. So this data from Redalic's Ariana Berceril shows the proportion of journals in Scopus that are from the global north, 81%, versus the global south, 18%, which is hugely problematic in terms of global equality and representation. And the second is that such metrics are based on the assumption that a journal can somehow appropriate and own the citations that accrue to the articles they publish. That a journal's citedness is somehow a reflection of its own inherent quality in attracting such good papers in the first place, and not just a bit of historical and geographical luck that they got themselves going at such a time and with such an editorial board that they became a feature of their community's scholarly landscape. But of course the same objections could be made about all journal metrics, so I dare say that these things could be tolerated about the GIF if it wasn't for the bigger issue, and that is framed in the opening statement to DORA, which protests not primarily against the construction of such metrics, but against their use for assessing individuals for funding, appointment and promotion. i.e. don't measure something that isn't a journal, person or a paper, with a journal metric. Instead, we should assess research on its own merits. And of course, a related problem with researchers being assessed by journal citation metrics is that along comes open access and funder open access policies, and they are all stymied by researchers' reluctance to give up publishing in high GIF, high cost, big deal packaged journals. So onto the anti-journal metrics bandwagon they hop, and now the 10th principle of Plan S is that funders should evaluate based on the intrinsic merit of the work and not on journal brand, metrics or publisher. Something swiftly adopted by the Wellcome Trust, where not only does the funder commit to not using journal metrics to assessing applicants, but grantees have to publicly commit to the DORA principles and have a plan in place to implement and monitor progress against those plans. And the UK are nervously awaiting the outcome of the UKRI open access policy consultation to see whether it also makes such demands on grantees. So we have 4 related but not the same issues. We have, firstly, problems with the construction of the GIF that you could probably apply to many journal metrics. We have problems with what a GIF actually measures. Is it journal quality, impact, something else entirely? Thirdly, we have problems with the way that the GIF came to be used as a lazy proxy for evaluating people and papers. And finally, the problems with the impact of this practice on the take-up of open access, amongst other things. Interestingly, on the third of these points, there is some debate as to whether the use of GIFs to assess individual papers is always wrong. And interestingly, a paper on exactly this topic by Ludo Waltman and Vincent Tragg, 2 big names in bibliometrics, was actually reviewed by Stephen Curry, the chair of DORA. And in it, whilst he had some legitimate criticisms of their methods, his main complaint was around how the article, especially the clickbaity title, might be misinterpreted as supporting the use of GIFs, especially by lazy laggard university research managers like me, who he thought would only read the title. None taken, Stephen. The message being, don't muddy the anti-GIF crusade with this sort of scholarly analysis. This battle is too important. Thus, the GIF and to a lesser degree other journal metrics have now become public enemy number 1, and the scholarly equivalent of Basil Fawlty's "don't mention the war" is "don't mention the GIF." GIFs? No, hate them. No GIFs here, wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. To the extent that when the Wellcome Trust produced the first draft of its DORA implementation guidance, as it was called, they went as far as suggesting that journal lists should be banned altogether, something the community successfully pushed back on, because actually when you look more closely at the DORA guidance, when it comes to publishers, the guidance is to greatly reduce rather than ban GIF as a promotional tool. But as an alternative, it suggests that if they do, they should add in lots of other journal metrics as well to provide a richer view of journal performance. And when you look at the other journal metrics DORA recommends, they aren't much better in terms of construction. So we've got the 5-year GIF, which is exactly the same as the 2-year GIF, but takes a longer citation window. We've got eigenfactor, which is another journal influence score based on Web of Science data, where all the eigenfactors sum to 100 across the citation network. So the bigger the journal, the bigger the influence, so not a reflection on quality. We've got the journal H-index, which is a heavily criticised indicator when it comes to individual researchers, because it's basically the half of the square root of your total citations. Go on, try it if you've got an H-index. So whilst it's ostensibly taking the number of publications into account, it doesn't really. It's largely a function of raw citation counts. And then we have the SciMargo journal rank, which basically starts life as a journal's impact factor and then calculates the extent to which each journal lends other journals its prestige across the citation network. And whilst it's meant to be field normalised, some disciplines don't have any top 10% SJR journals at all, and others have a lot. So none of these are massively better than the GIF. but they don't get the same bad press because, of course, they don't have the traction of the GIF, so they've not been subject to the same scrutiny. Indeed, when Elsevier developed their site score metric, which is basically the GIF, but over a longer time frame and with some slightly different publication types, and then included it as an example of the way they adhered to the Leiden Manifesto, no one really batted an eyelid, despite GIF being utterly demonised by the Leiden Manifesto's comrade in arms, DORA. But of course, these aren't the only journal citation metrics in the world. There are hundreds more, and I once spent a rainy afternoon copying some of them out onto this PowerPoint slide before I lost the will to live. And I think this just raises the important point that the answer to the GIF in terms of construction might already be with us. We just don't know it yet because those with the power to bring these metrics to our attention are the big bibliographic databases that are married to the GIF and their GIF equivalents. So this leaves researchers such as John Tregoning at Imperial College getting increasingly fed up, so much so that he went on record in Nature a few years back saying, "Stop telling us that the GIF doesn't matter and tell us what does." And this, of course, is a very good question. What does matter about journals? Now, for the past 3 years, I've chaired the INORMS Research Evaluation Working Group, which has developed a process for thinking through evaluation design problems like this. It's called SCOPE, which is an acronym, and the very first stage of the SCOPE model is to start with what we value, which is exactly John's question. If we shouldn't value a journal's citedness, what should we value? And I think the first question we have to ask ourselves here is, who's we? Because this is what got us into trouble in the first place with journal citation metrics. So Eugene Garfield created the GIF because he wanted to know which journals to put in his citation index. Then librarians adopted it for journal selection, and then researchers started using it to choose where to publish, and then funders started using it to identify who to fund. But arguably all these groups value different things about journals, and some didn't value journals at all but just used them as a proxy for something else. So we need to start with what it is the evaluating group actually values about journals, and not just with the available data, which is largely bibliographic, and nor with what others value about journals. And once we've understood that, the second step of SCOPE is to consider the context in which we're doing the measuring. And I hear many arguments about which indicators are responsible and which are not, but we can't have that conversation without knowing the context, the why and the what in which the indicator is going to be used. And obviously, are journal metrics good or bad is a very common question, hence exploring it today. But we can't answer that question without first discussing the context in which the indicator is going to be used. And the matrix here plots 6 different reasons for evaluating with 4 different entities of different sizes. But we could easily add journals on here. And it seeks to colour code them according to the impact of any evaluation in that space. So comparing one country with another for the sole purpose of understanding their relative production levels has very little impact on those countries and therefore is a low risk activity. But any form of evaluation which results in reward at the level of the individual has a significant impact on those individuals, and so it's a red high risk activity and extreme caution should be taken. So as we've learned from DORA, the use of indicators by journal publishers to show off their features is a medium risk activity. It's not banned, but a reduction in usage is encouraged. But the use of indicators by universities or others to reward their scholars is a high impact, high risk activity. So we need to think such evaluations through very carefully and certainly not just throw journal metrics at the job, hence DORA calling for their elimination. So let's take as our researchers, and ask, what do researchers value about journals? Well, one of the principles of the scope framework is to evaluate with the evaluated. So ideally we do this exercise with a group of researchers. And if this was a live session, we could explore this together. But as it is, I've had to do this on my own. And I've presented here 5 key things that I think researchers mainly value about journals. And they are, firstly, readership. Who is the audience? This idea of journal as a community or club. Does my community read it, publish in it, rate it? Secondly, rigour. What standards am I going to be held to if I publish in here? What's the peer review like? Is it open peer review? Is the editorial board international? Do I need to pre-register and make my data available? Thirdly, reach. How visible is this journal? How open is it? What's the preprint policy? Who gets to retain copyright? Fourthly, response. What are the turnaround times? What are the success rates in this journal? And finally, I guess as a result of the previous 4 R's, what recognition am I going to get for publishing here? So when we look at this list, we can ask ourselves how many of these things can actually be legitimately measured by citations to previous articles in that journal. And I would say possibly part of reach. A journal's visibility could partly be understood through its citedness. Indeed, despite being anti-journal metrics, DORA themselves have published in Nature, a journal with one of the highest GIFs in the world. So assuming it's not because they think Nature's citedness says something about their own submission to it, we can only assume it's because Nature offers visibility and reach that they couldn't get from another journal. And in what context do researchers seek to evaluate journals? Well, ultimately, it's simply to compare one with another for selection purposes. But of course, there are challenges with that simple process due to the range of things they value about journals, not least the gaining of recognition, as we will discuss later. So now we have our values and our context, and we can think about our options for evaluating journals that address all of these other aspects not currently addressed by journal citation metrics. And when we look at options within scope, we seek to explore both qualitative and quantitative indicators, and as a general rule, focus on qualitative indicators for qualitative things such as peer review approach, and quantitative indicators for quantitative things such as turnaround times. Luckily for us, a group of scholars from the big centres of bibliometric excellence at CWTS Leiden, University of Indiana and Montreal have started thinking about better ways of judging journals. And they've come up with this helpful checklist of the characteristics of improved journal indicators, many of which you can see directly address DORA's objections to the GIF around validity, transparency and gaming. So let's see what alternatives are out there that might reflect our researchers' values in helping them choose a journal. Obviously, the thing that's usually held up in opposition to metrics is peer review. So peer-curated journal lists might seem like the perfect antidote to cold, hard, data-driven journal rankings. Indeed, that's the idea behind some of the Scandinavian research assessment approaches, such as the Finnish Publication Forum and the Norwegian Register of Scientific Journals. So these journals are assigned quality levels by humans in accordance with pre-agreed criteria, so 0 to 3 in Finland and 0 to 2 in Norway. There is also the infamous Chartered Association of Business Schools ABS list or journal guide, where a range of indicators and expert views are used to categorise business journals as 1 to 4 star, again according to their quality. Now this might sound okay until you realise that the humans creating these lists are very much influenced by pre-existing reputational indicators. So some work by Sarella and Karkainen showed that actually the Finnish Publication Forum rankings can mostly be predicted using existing data such as citations. But more importantly, such lists are again labouring under the assumption that journals have an inherent quality that is independent of the work submitted to them, and that this quality is unidimensional and can therefore be assigned a single category. They ignore the broader range of things that we might value about journals, such as readership, who you might be writing for, dimensions of rigour, whether pre-registration is required, for example, and response, which is not a criterion at all. But due to their link with funding, they do, rightly or wrongly, hit the recognition criteria with researchers, because they know that existing scholars have rated them highly. Perhaps the main direct challenger to the GIF is the TOP factor, produced by the team at the Centre for Open Science. So TOP stands for Transparency and Openness Promotion, so addresses our rigour and reach requirements. And they score journals out of 3 based on the extent to which they make openness and transparency demands on their researchers. One of the drawbacks is that it doesn't yet cover all titles because it's a hugely labour-intensive process, as you can imagine. But I think the biggest drawback is that it might just end up rewarding the status quo, as it's the established journals that can afford to implement these changes and make such requests of their authors without risking them going to a less demanding journal down the road. However, at least it's measuring something that the journal can itself take credit for, and it doesn't rely on citations, which arguably shouldn't be accrued at the level of the journal at all. And I think it does have the capacity to offer recognition to researchers due to the increased kind of rigour benefits. Another manual process, but crowdsourced this time, sits behind the Quality Open Access Market Initiative for scoring open access journals based on the quality of their service to authors. So journals are scored by researchers based on their own experiences around the journal's response time, peer review process, whether they'd recommend it, and interestingly, given that many authors don't pay their own APCs, whether they think it's good value for money. And a journal's final score relates to its average score across these criteria, normalised to a degree by the robustness of the score, i.e. how many scorecards the journal has received. A similar idea, but not limited to open access journals, is SciRev, which seeks to speed up the scholarly knowledge production by providing data on manuscript handling times and the peer review process. I'm not quite sure how this data speeds up knowledge production. It sounds a little bit like trying to fatten a pig by weighing it. They also supply some other data, including 2- and 5-year impact factors, although not many have this detail. You can then look at all the data for journals within a particular discipline and rank them by overall rating. But of course, some of the journals only have 1 review, so you have to be a little bit cautious about this. The Platform for Responsible Editorial Policies, PREP, produced by CWTS Leiden, also seeks to tap into this desire to surface some of the rigour and response interests of researchers by displaying in a nice graphical format information about the transparency and openness of journal peer review policies. Again, really nice idea, but it currently only indexes 445 journals, no doubt because, again, it's got a hugely labour-intensive process. One free-to-use service that does index a huge number of journals, almost 5,000, is the Sherpa Romeo database of publisher open access policies. Of course, this helps researchers understand some aspects of a journal's reach by outlining the various routes to openness that they provide, including embargo periods, license options, and preprint policies. Sherpa also provides Sherpa Fact for checking whether a journal meets various mainly UK funder open access policies. And of course, we now have the Plan S journal checker tool, which does a similar job, but for Coalition S funders specifically. The problem we have here is the increasing number of read and publish or publish and read deals that individual institutions have with publishers, meaning that it's hard for external services such as Sherpa Fact or Plan S JCT to keep up with what open access options an individual academic might have access to. And of course, openness is only one form of visibility. If we take citedness as another form of visibility, then we really want to know which journals are both highly cited and highly open. And of course, we don't have that information in one place yet. However, the Dutch do, lucky them, by negotiating all their open access deals at a national level. The Dutch have been able to provide a really helpful journal checking tool, which not only provides details of any read and publish deal, but also some journal citation metrics and also the green open access options from Sherpa Romeo. So this is really useful and something I think we've been crying out for here in the UK. Of course, all the data sources I've demonstrated so far are open and free to use, but if you've got a few quid burning a hole in your institutional back pocket, then you could invest in Cable's Journalytics. So they provide response time and acceptance rate data, which is supplied by the journals themselves. But they also seek to provide some rigour and reach metrics, including their own bespoke Cable's classification index, which uses Scopus citation data to score journals using a percentile rank relative to other journals in the discipline. They've got a difficulty of acceptance percentile rank using the data they collate from publishers on acceptance rates. They have an altmetric median mentions per article score, although with no real indication here as to what's a good number. And interestingly, they've started to introduce the new Cite Journal Index, which provides a ratio of positive or neutral citations to the overall volume of citations that journal received over a time window. Although I think we do have to question, what does it mean if a journal has large volumes of disputing citations? Isn't that just how scholarship works? And can a journal really claim ownership of the proportion of positive to negative citations? Anyway, we can conclude that Cable's provides a smorgasbord of indicators, but if we go back to our values around readership, well, there's nothing really on that. Rigour, well, difficulty of acceptance possibly, but nothing on openness, etc. For reach, they offer traditional citations and altmetrics, but they do have some useful response time data. So the sources I've listed here are by no means the only sources of data and indicator on journals, as this spreadsheet from Jeroen Bosnan on the sources of journal peer review data show us, and I've provided the URL as there's no way you'll be able to really read this. But whilst there are lots of sources of journal data and metrics, they do suffer from some common problems. And this is where, again, the good folks at CWTS Leiden have done some more of the work for us, summarising some of the key problems with these sources, many of which I've highlighted as we've gone through. So for the free-to-use services, their coverage is often limited, only dealing with a very small subset of titles. And this is mainly because there's a lot of manual work involved in extracting this data. So there's often also missing information, or it's inaccurate or quickly outdated. Where organisations do collect useful data, there's often little coordination between them, meaning work is duplicated or not easily interoperable, and end users get confused as to where to go for what data and what the data actually means. And those infrastructures are often precarious, run by small teams on low budgets, often on a project basis. Which is why I guess commercial entities have historically stepped in, and I guess that's what we're seeing with Cables. And if I was going to make some broad brush observations between the two, I'd say that largely community-run efforts tend to be strongly value-led with strong theoretical underpinnings based on researcher needs, but they often lack in terms of coverage and resource. Whereas commercial sources are obviously well resourced and journal coverage is high, but they seem to have weaker theoretical underpinnings. What do these indicators actually mean? And whilst they might be cross at me for saying they're not value led, they are commercial organisations. So if it's not financially viable, they won't do it. And that stands to reason. So to go back to what researchers value about journals, there's not a lot of options currently for measuring what matters to researchers about journals for the purpose of journal benchmarking or choice. In terms of readership, there are no real audience data and indicators, and important information about which journals represent your community has to get passed on through some kind of oral tradition, PI to postgrad. In terms of rigour, there are some experiments here, such as the top factor and the quality open access market, but the journal coverage is poor. In terms of reach, we have either traditional journal visibility metrics or alt metrics and some open access data through Sherpa Romeo, but not in the same place. In terms of response, again, we're starting to see data on turnaround times and success rates, but it's either patchy or commercially owned. And then we get to recognition. And there is nothing yet in these new offers to challenge the dominance of journal citation metrics or journal listings, such as the ABS list, although I think there is potential if the top factor gains traction. But I think the bigger question here is, do we want journals and their proxy journal metrics to be used for researcher recognition? Indeed, the probe stage of scope warns us to think about the unintended consequences of our evaluation choices, and we're already very well aware of the problems with the use of journal brands and metrics for rewarding individual researchers. However, the heartbreaking truth is that whilst researchers value all sorts of things about journals, the thing they value the most is recognition. They operate in a reputation economy. That is, what many researchers value most about journal metrics is not what they say about the journal, but what the journal metric says about them. And if we go back to John Tregoning's question, it wasn't really, how do I find journal metrics that tell me more meaningful things about journals, but how are you going to judge me if not by journal metrics? And that's why a lot of effort put into alternative journal metrics might not fly if we only tell researchers to value other things when you choose a journal and don't answer the question, what are we going to value when we choose you? And that's why researchers are, if they're honest, as this poll from the 2019 Open Research Conference at King's College shows, still looking to JIFs to choose where to publish. So at the top there, 81% of the honest souls admitted that they do this. That's not to say that the work on alternative journal metrics isn't valuable, although it does still embed the journal as the de facto means of scholarly communication. But we need to also invest time in answering this other question, how are you going to judge me? So where does this leave us? What can journal metrics actually tell us? Well, even though I pose this question myself, I'm going to say it's the wrong question. And one of our problems is that we spend too much time agonising over what journal metrics can and can't tell us, when in accordance with the scope framework, we should never start with an indicator and work backwards like this, but instead we should start with what we value about the thing we're evaluating, in this case journals, and work forwards. And if we start with what we value about journals and are clear about who we is, and consider the context why we're measuring, and our indicators meet certain criteria, options, and we probe our choices for unintended consequences, they can tell us useful things about what we value about journals. And yes, in some contexts, that might even include journal citation metrics. The problem comes when we start with an indicator and begin overloading it with lots of different meanings which it can't possibly live up to. A single journal indicator can never identify the best researcher or the best paper. It can't even identify the best journal, best at what. But we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I want to finish by commending to you an initiative in this space being developed by CWTS Leiden and the Quality Open Access Market folk on the back of the challenge Post in Nature about better journal indicators. And that is the creation of a bazaar for journal information. The idea of the bazaar is that yes, a one-dimensional perspective on journals, e.g. based on JIFs or where they're indexed, or on crude predatory, non-predatory distinctions, etc., does lead to poor evaluations. However, attempts to make journals invisible in research evaluations, when they might actually have some relevance in shaping identities of researchers and in representing scientific communities, might also be unhelpful. So they hope to offer a broad, multi-dimensional perspective on journals, providing a better understanding of the roles that journals play in the evaluation and dissemination of scientific knowledge. So how they organise their editorial processes, what kinds of impact they have, how open are they, how diverse are they, etc. So that this can be given appropriate consideration in research evaluations in a way that is responsible and doesn't simply reduce journals to a one-dimensional metric such as the GIF. Of course, the challenge here is systematising all this sort of information, so their first task is to establish an infrastructure to surface this data via a single interface, no mean feat, and whilst ensuring that no one entity gets to say what journal information is legitimate and what is not. So a really interesting initiative and something to watch. And they are welcoming partners and feedback, so do go to the blog to find out more about that if it interests you. So that is it from me. Thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you during the Q&A on Monday the 12th of April. Thank you.